Let me do some quick introductions for your two speakers today, and then we'll put in perspective why it is we're asking them to address this here in Seattle. That is not hurricane country. Christa López is the Deputy Director for Field Programs, Chief of Staff for the Community Development and Revitalization with the Texas General Land Office, which sounds like a title that should come with a horse. In this role, she leads the first ever state-led and FEMA-funded direct housing mission, as well as coordinates staff and program for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. If you hear us throw acronyms around, that might be one of the more frequent ones, Cdbg-DR. That's what that stands for. Krista was the Section Administrator for Human Services at the Texas Division of Emergency Management, and in that role served as Human Services Branch Director in the State Emergency Operations Center and as the Individual Assistance Branch Director for federally declared disasters. She has professional experience at the state and federal level, working in the realms of crisis and emergency response. For 18 years, she worked as a university administrator at the University of Texas at Austin, Colorado State University, and at Shippensburg University, and we're so glad to have you here. Sara Labovitz is one of our, I'm just going to call Houston a sister city for now, because we have shared so many plans and checklists. Sara is the Assistant Director for Communications and Public Policy at the City of Houston Housing and Community Development Department. She served as the Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Department of State, back when we had a Department of State, during the first Obama administration, and co-founded the New York University Stern Center for Business and Human Rights in 2013. In 2017, she moved to Houston and directed the Houston Organizing Movement for Equity, acronym HOME Coalition, which advocates for equity and disaster recovery. Sara has a master's in law and diplomacy from Tufts University and a bachelor's of history from Grinnell College. Now, the reason we've asked these two experts to come and talk to us is not because we expect 54 inches of rain and hurricane surge and 24,000 homes in Houston, more than 1 million in the state of Texas, inundated by floodwaters. However, what we're preparing for is a really, really big earthquake that is also going to strand equal numbers of people in our communities. So ironically, the modeling that we've done looks very similar to what Houston experienced because of flooding. But what we're going to experience is a result of shaking that comes with absolutely no warning. I'm delighted to see Quinn and Tom and our other partners from different levels of government, because we're going to be relying on Washington and FEMA Region 10 the way I know Houston and the Texas General Land Office worked very closely together as well. So if this was the case for us, what would we do about that? What we've done so far is to develop a not fully fleshed out, but a really good start to a post-disaster recovery framework. It's not called a plan, because the plan has to be exact in details. And until the earth shakes and we know the exact impacts, we'll need to customize what an actual plan is. But our framework has already envisioned what happened after Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy and the Chilean earthquake and the Japanese earthquakes and many other incidents around the nation that have taught us things about recovery. A part of our planning is a chapter called a recovery support function that deals specifically with housing. And so these 4 goals sound ever so naive, ever so antiseptic, ever so easy, because the shaking hasn't happened yet. But we're imagining we will need to develop immediately an impact analysis, a housing strategy, and apply our values to making sure that we get people back into affordable and safe housing. So this is the point we're starting from. We get more specific when we learn lessons like we're going to learn today. So the way the program is going to work today is we're going to kick it off by asking Sara to talk from the city perspective, and she's going to give us a little bit of education, because the city of Seattle has never in its history used some of the programs we're going to need to become not just aware of, but smart about using. So she's going to help educate us in a very friendly way. And then talk a little bit about what the Houston specific experience with housing is like. When she has finished, somewhere around mid-morning-ish, we will take a break. We'll ask Krista to share the experience of what did it look like from a state level, because it wasn't just Houston that flooded. And although we care very, very much about Houston, we need to put this into the perspective of what happens when our neighboring counties in all of Western Washington and perhaps Oregon or Southern British Columbia are in the same boat. Again, be writing down any specific questions you've got, and we'll share those with them, but I'm sure they'll also be conversational throughout. We're going to save the last 20 minutes of today's presentation for them each to take 10 minutes and say, my advice to you, Seattle, if you knew for a fact that your housing devastating earthquake was happening exactly a month from now, what should you most focus on? What is highest priority? It's ironic that we have these two experts with us today, almost to the date, 2 years following Hurricane Harvey. They are credible, they are friendly, they are wise, and we are looking forward to what they have to share with us today. Would you help me welcome Sarah?
Okay, is that on? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much for having me, and Barb, for that really warm introduction. And it's just amazing who you have here in the room. And I think it is so important to have so many different geographic entities represented, but then also just multiple layers of government and governance. And that's certainly been one of the first lessons learned for us, is how important that team infrastructure is as you try and do so many different things, especially when it comes to post-disaster housing. I thought I would start off by just drawing out some of the expertise in the room and just kind of find out, like, what is on your mind as we start the day. And also, if anyone wants to give me a little bit of education about what you all think about when you think about the big one, because obviously 54 inches of rain and an earthquake are very different. And so I just kind of want to get myself in the context that you all think about. But does anyone want to start off with questions or some basic 101 on the big one?
All the bridges go down, people are isolated, we can't get to them.
Many homes in Seattle and the wider region being made of unreinforced masonry and falling down around most residents.
For more residents in the downtown, greater downtown area, they're living in high-rise buildings.
What about the high-rise?
That are living in high-rise.
Living high-rise. And what happens to them?
That's the question.
Okay. Fair. What about your subsidized housing? We had some housing authority people here. Yeah.
I work with the Office of Housing. A lot of the housing that the city funds, and that's an important distinction, we don't own it or manage it or anything like that, relies on on-site staff who can't afford to live in the city. So if the earthquake were to happen during night or something like that, a lot of the buildings, a lot of people who live in the city's affordable housing are very frail, elderly, medically compromised, mentally ill, and if it were to happen in the evening, staff probably could not get to those buildings.
Interesting. So that's for just the affordable housing that you fund.
Correct.
And then we have some housing authority folks. What about the housing, the subsidized housing that you own and manage?
It would primarily be self-sufficiency for the residents, because as he pointed out, you have limited staff and crew in order to maintain that property closeness.
I'm going to dogpile because many of the retirement homes, not even managed by SHA or affordable housing, are not staffed at night either.
Okay. What is your renter-owner breakdown?
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
51% of us now are renters.
Okay.
And it's a very different experience coming back in housing if you rent as opposed to ownership.
All right. Good. So it's not so different than a big flood. And I think we'll get a little bit more into, Krista's going to talk a little bit more about the impact of Harvey across the state of Texas. But, you know, we had 4 days of nonstop rain, and I had recently moved to Texas. It's my, you know, we were talking yesterday. It's easy for me to approach this issue from a beginner mindset because I was a beginner when Harvey happened, and it really was my first major natural disaster. And been interesting to me in the rain since then. When you hear 6 inches of rain, it feels like a lot of rain. Well, 54 inches of rain is a ton of rain. And in Houston, we had experienced, Harvey was our 5th federally declared disaster in 3 years. So in each of 2015 and 2016, we had 2 federally declared disasters related to flooding in pockets of Houston. It was not the citywide or really statewide flooding that we saw with Harvey, but at the housing department where I work, we manage what is called, referenced earlier, the Cdbg, Community Development Block Grant Program, which is HUD's funding for affordable housing. The Cdbg DR, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, is also managed through our department. And in 2015 and 2016, we got federal funds for housing recovery, and we're managing, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pathways in a minute, but we were managing some of that directly, and some of it we were managing through a sub-grant from the state. So our department had a little bit of experience with that disaster recovery program, in addition to some experience from Hurricane Ike in 2008. And so I think that we've got some, I don't know who manages your Cdbg programs here, but I bet it's some of your housing.
Human services.
Human services, okay, so okay. So we've got some folks who are kind of our counterpart agency on that front here. One of the things that I think it's really important to break down, you can pretty quickly get into acronym city when it comes, I don't have to tell you guys this, at the OEM, in the OEM world. But I thought it might be helpful to kind of break down the Cdbg DR, that Community Development Block Grant piece, because when you think about housing recovery, I think it's easy to flip to the immediate aftermath and what are you going to do in the emergency itself. But if you think about long-term housing recovery in line with your values, as Barb said, then you've got to also think about this federal grant program for long-term housing recovery. And one of the challenges that we have, within our own little universe of where we administer Cdbg entitlement grants, it's sort of apparent what that means. But all of a sudden, your whole community is going to start caring about this kind of obscure and pretty difficult to navigate federal program. So I want to kind of talk about what that looks like, give you a map so that you can start to imagine it, think about it, and be able to educate others about it so that you can make the best use of these funds. And for context, in Houston, we have about $1.3 billion through the Cdbg DR program for affordable housing. So that's for housing recovery from Hurricane Harvey, which is the biggest investment in affordable housing in Houston in a generation. It's more money than we've gotten in 30 years of the housing department being in existence. So it's this huge influx of funding, and that is both an enormous opportunity and an enormous challenge. And as you start to think about what might happen after the big one, thinking about this enormous pot of money that has the potential to come to the state or the city, and what opportunities might you realize with those funds, I think it's an important thing to start thinking about as you think about housing recovery. So what I wanted to do, you can take this. Are these sticky? No. Okay. I'm really excited, too, that you have some people from your legislative offices, because I think working in government, we often, people like to put their heads down, and we're sort of above politics. But one of the things about disaster recovery is there's a lot of money at stake, so it's inherently political. And really kind of embracing that aspect, I think, is an important reality of the post-disaster context. So so you've got your disaster. And the first thing, so you'll have some FEMA programs, your OEM stuff, your immediate shelter, all of that. That will be in one universe, and that sort of, I don't know very much about that. Krista knows a lot about that, but and Barb knows a lot about that. But so this is your kind of sheltering and immediate housing assistance. But on the same track or on the same time, Congress in Washington is going to start to meet, and they're going to appropriate money for the disaster. How much money are they going to appropriate? And to whom are big questions. And when we talk about the politics of it, that's really important. So Mississippi, after Hurricane Katrina, initially got more money than Louisiana because Haley Barbour was their senator and he was very good at asking for money. So how much money is Congress going to appropriate? So once Congress appropriates the money, who are they appropriating it to? Well, they appropriate it to federal agencies. And they're going to appropriate it to HUD, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But they also appropriate money to FEMA to continue to do, they basically calculate what's the burn rate for FEMA. So if FEMA is deploying across the region, how quickly are they going through money? How much do they need to keep going? SBA loans. That's for small businesses, but also for households. The Department of Agriculture, that's your disaster SNAP, food assistance, maybe the Department of Transportation, maybe the Army Corps. So you'll see a number of federal agencies funded out of this initial appropriation. But for housing recovery, what we really care about is this HUD funding. And what HUD does is they publish a Federal Register notice. And this is, in our case, a 70-page document that has very detailed, this is the rules for the money for this particular disaster. And depending on when the big one happens, if it happens in the current context, there is essentially no statutory framework for disaster recovery. And so Congress and the agencies make it up every time. This makes it very difficult to plan for. So when you talk about creating a framework, that makes a lot of sense because there is no federal playbook or set of rules that you can go to in advance. So from a public policy perspective, we can discuss that. There's a bill currently being considered, I think it was introduced in both the Senate and the House, on disaster recovery reform. So there's a lot, and if you get hit with the big one, you'll become part of the family that goes to Washington to advocate for this sort of thing. But HUD is going to publish the rules for your specific disaster. And what that means, so some of the rules that they might publish are, what are the low and moderate income requirements? So in our case, 70% of the funds must be spent to benefit low and moderate income people. Can you rebuild in the floodway? In your case, it might be, can you rebuild in, I don't know anything about earthquakes, but what are the resiliency standards for how you rebuild? Are you able to provide assistance to people who did not maintain insurance? Are there different requirements for people based on their income? So all of those kinds of regulations will be published in the Federal Register notice. And if, as in our case and in most major storms, there were multiple entities that were affected, the Federal Register notice will allocate money to the different affected entities. So you've got your Federal Register notice, so it may appropriate money to the state of Washington, to the state of Oregon, to the state of California, et cetera, et cetera. Each of which will then have to write an action plan. So this is when you get to your plan part. Send it back to HUD. HUD has to approve it in order for you to be able to draw down the funds. Now, you're a city, like we're a city. So the question is, so you got to write an action plan. It goes back to HUD, and then HUD finally sends you money. But the question for you all is, does that money get a stop in Seattle in terms of who controls it before you can actually start helping anyone? So the point of all of that is that it's a long journey from the start of the disaster through multiple federal and state entities before you can actually get to helping anyone. And to give you some context about time, our storm happened August 25th, 2017. So that's our disaster event. Congress appropriated money, the first tranche, in September of 2017. So a month later, there have been some additional appropriations. HUD published the Federal Register notice in February of 2018, so 6 months after the storm. The state of Texas, we submitted our action plan. So some negotiation about who was going to control the money. We have a large sub-grant agreement from the state. So the state submitted their action plan in the summer of 2018. Ours was submitted to HUD in the fall, in October of 2018, and was finally approved in December of 2018. We signed a contract with the state in January of 2019. So 18 months after the storm was the point at which we had an approved framework, so all the planning and everything else, to start finally issuing programs. And we rebuilt our first house in May of 2019. And that was considered lightning speed for HUD. This is not an easy process. And I think the important message for you all, and this is why this exercise is so important, is that it requires a kind of thoughtful flexibility and adaptability, because you can understand the basic framework, but until the disaster strikes, you won't know the specific rules and whatever the constraints are. And because there are so many disasters happening right now, we're in a kind of disruptive period when it comes to how this program is administered. Because it's not Hurricane Katrina, 10 years later, Hurricane Sandy, 10 years later, Hurricane Harvey. It's now we've got Harvey, Irma, Maria, Michael, Florence, all happening in this 2017-2018 period. California wildfires, you've had so many different disaster events that the national framework is in flux. So for you all, this kind of exercise and this thoughtful planning, I think, is really important. Let me pause there and take some questions about this framework. Yes?
Are you aware of, or are there any circumstances where the federal government sort of relaxes the cross-cutting federal regulations, especially around household income? Or is that a negotiation within the disaster response?
Sir, can you repeat the question?
So the question is, does the federal government ever relax? You can, or you can say it into the microphone, which is next to you.
I'm hearing with block grant, and I have some experience with block grant. And I'm just wondering if there are circumstances, or are you aware where the federal government has relaxed cross-cutting federal regulations, especially around household income?
Like relaxed in which?
Like you talked about, 70% of your allocation was going to be used for low income. What if there were, it could be anywhere from 0 to somebody who was above 80% of median or something like that?
So the disaster recovery block grant program is administered by HUD, whose mission is to advance affordable housing. And so the rules typically do come with income requirements. And this again is political. Depends on what the impact is and who your political leadership is, what their commitments are. They certainly, I think, for different storms have had different kinds of income requirements and sought waivers. So in Louisiana, they were rebuilding large beach homes. I heard some very expensive homes being rebuilt in Long Island. I think in Houston, we've made a commitment to spend 80% of our funds on low and moderate income people because of the way that the storm impacted Houston. But the context for Harris County, which is kind of our sister, King County, is that? Yeah. So we have a similar kind of relationship with Harris County. And, for us, the way that Houston is organized, it's not very hard for us to meet those income targets. I think for the state and for the county, you have just a more spread out population. Depending on where the impact was, you could have different income levels impacted. But that, again, is where this becomes very political. Mm-hmm.
So since we know that the DR money is so long in coming, I got two questions. One is, while you were waiting for that money, with hindsight now, is there anything that you can say, we wish we had done X while we were waiting so that we could be better prepared? Or we wish we could have planned better so that it would shorten the time for the DR money to be allocated? And then after receive the notice in the Federal Register of what you can and cannot do, did you have any curveballs thrown at you to say, you can use money here, but not there? And then now you have to scramble to find backup money to do what they won't let you do. And does that figure into your equation for what you should have done to be better prepared in the beginning?
I feel like I could talk for like several hours over several drinks about the many aspects of that question. So let me talk about a couple of things that we did that I would do again in that period, and then some things that I wish we had done better. So it's not like you sit on your hands and just wait. You're not just sort of like, well, when the money arrives, we'll start working. You're doing a lot of planning, community engagement, needs assessment. There's a bunch of things that you're doing in that interim period. And while there is no statutory framework, you can look at the Federal Register notices HUD is not reinventing them time to time. So you have a pretty good sense of what's coming when it comes to that Federal Register notice. So I passed out, this is for a spread that we're doing in a 2-year report, so I just printed it out for you guys. And it gives you something of a sense of what we were doing in the interim period. So this page talks about the unmet needs assessment that we did. And this is something I would 5 stars would recommend. Because the amount of money that you get and the way that you design your programs needs to be tied back to the impact of the disaster and your unmet need. So the way that HUD calculates your unmet need is based on FEMA verified loss. So like 3 weeks after the disaster. And what we know about the way that people respond to FEMA is that it tends to disproportionately undercount low and moderate income people. So people who faced all kinds of disadvantages before the storm are less likely to raise their hand for help. They're less likely to have expensive homes or expensive belongings that are recognized with high amounts of loss, even though as a matter of proportion, they may have lost much more. And so what we did is we worked with a firm called Civis Analytics to use data science and flood inundation mapping and consumer data and social vulnerability data to come up with a more sophisticated analysis of what we thought the impact was. And that data has been really helpful to us in informing how we develop our programs. Where do we do outreach, for example? On the other side, you'll see we did door-to-door canvassing across Houston. Well, we'd like to go in areas where people are less likely to be connected to the internet, they're likely to have had high impact from the storm, that sort of thing. And the second thing we did is we worked with a Texas-based organization called NowCab to do an analysis of housing vulnerability in the year after Harvey. And that, again, is helping us inform where we're making investments. So we often think about housing recovery in terms of, politically, your biggest pain point is going to be your home repair program, because you can never imagine the issues that people will have in rebuilding their homes, and people will complain, and it's politically just challenging. There are many other things that you can do with the disaster money, though, like invest in multifamily. So we just did $100 million for 11 multifamily deals all over the city, where we're using this data to help us understand where would be good if we care about things like preventing displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods, or building close to good schools, or in places where home values are rising. This data and this report has really helped us do that. So those are some things that we did in the interim period. We also did a lot of community engagement, where we partnered with community organizations to inform our action plan. And in 2 months, in May and June of last year, we held 18 different community events around the city to just get feedback about what people's priorities were as we were preparing the action plan. Some challenges for us were staffing. It's really hard. It was hard for us. It has been hard for us to really imagine that staffing plan. We go from being an organization of 150 employees, a budget of $40 or $50 million, mostly federal funds to underwrite multifamily, do some home repair, fund some public services, to being a $250 million organization very, very quickly. And the level of staff up, the relationship with contractors, that has been, we've had some successes and some setbacks. And it's been that has been a big challenge for us. And I think that the kind of thing that you're doing now in creating relationships with other jurisdictions that have gone through this, the best advice that we have gotten has been from other states and cities. There will be a lot of consultants who will come and offer advice to you. But the most trustworthy advice has been from those who've been through this before. And in terms of curveballs, the biggest curveball has been the mitigation funding. So similar to you guys, big flood, lots of infrastructure impact. You'll have infrastructure impact. Where does that get addressed in the federal framework? Does that come through FEMA? Does it come through HUD? And for us, there has been an 18-month lag in the publication of the Federal Register notice for what they call mitigation funding. And HUD doesn't know how they define mitigation. So we're still waiting. We expect by the beginning of September 2019, so more than 2 years after the storm, to have a HUD Federal Register notice published for $4 billion for infrastructure investment in Texas. And we don't know what the planning process will look like because that has been a big unknown.
Talk to us a little bit about the Houston split of the rental market and homeownership market. And you heard we're about 50-50% here in Seattle. And how did you deal with the unique variabilities associated with those two?
So we are 57% renters within the city of Houston. It's about 50-50 in our region when you take into account Harris County. Renters are, homeowners live in place and, on some level have defined need. The renters are more difficult to serve, and you could spend all of your money on rental assistance, which is what the community really wants, to help renters who've been displaced and that sort of thing. So you have some tough choices to make. And where we are investing is, one, just increasing the stock of affordable housing and guaranteed affordable. And I understand you all have done a big push around funding affordable housing, inclusionary zoning. They like to say in Houston, zoning is a four-letter word. We don't have inclusionary zoning, but really using for us we have $350 million budgeted for multifamily investment in our recovery budget. And one of the things we're able to do with that money is set conditions. So we've been pretty aggressive about resilient design, located close to good schools, transit-oriented, using the power of the purse to entice more developers to the table, and adding standards to what they have to do. And as I said, we just finished the first round of that funding, so we just funded 11 deals. I don't know what scale. It sounds like you guys are doing some exciting things, lots of units coming online. I was sort of jealous listening. How many units are you guys, do you know? Tens of thousands, yeah. So I think that the disaster money is an opportunity to invest in that and to just even expand even more. I don't know, how are you guys funding all of that?
In a wide variety of ways.
Yes. Well, add this to your variety, because it's a lot of money that you can use to do things like fund resilient multifamily. The other thing we're doing is Homebuyer Assistance, and I'm sure you all have a Homebuyer Assistance program, but we're funding that through the disaster money as well so that renters can become homebuyers. And then we're also funding wraparound public services. So we have a public services program that addresses homelessness, legal aid, transportation needs for very vulnerable people. You can also fund that through the disaster money. And the notion that, housing, we talk about this in the homelessness context, housing first, but not housing only. And so some of those wraparound services you can also fund through the disaster money.
Thank you. I was wondering, we've learned a lot from Barb and the Office of Emergency Management about the importance of the preventative work that we could be engaged in around retrofits for our unreinforced masonry buildings, and particularly focusing on the most vulnerable parts of our city. I was curious, I know it would be a different context for you all, but what benefits that we may not even be aware of that preventative work and investment in your infrastructure, what that might mean in terms of expediting HUD funds, or what that means for your budget writers in terms of leveraging money when the earthquake hits. Just any context that you have or lessons learned around the preventative work we could be doing, or resources we could be leveraging at the local, state level, or with our private sector partners.
I hear everyone wants to figure out how you can expedite the money, and I just want to set realistic expectations about how fast it's going to be. And some of the challenges, and this is something for you guys to think about as a city. What is your relationship with the state? And is the state going to get the money and give you a sub-grant? Are they going to have you apply on a program-by-program basis to their program? Are you going to be able to write your own rules? How will they differ from the state rules? And that's a fundamentally political question. So something for your political leadership to start thinking about. Are you going to have a Seattle plan that stands wholly on its own with a relationship with HUD? Are you going to have a Seattle mostly independent plan that also relates to the state plan? Or are you going to be a component of a state plan? And how much autonomy will you have, and how much autonomy do you want? And so, what is your ability to write in standards around resilient rebuild design? What choices do you make about quantity versus quality? So if it's more expensive to rebuild in a resilient way, if you want to mandate the use of certain kinds of building materials or create incentives for, in our case, permeable driveways or whatever. How does that affect the number of households that you would be able to help with your budget, if you have a budget, if you have autonomy? And then what waivers, so is HUD setting the rules, or is the state setting the rules, and do you need waivers in order to do what you want to do? So for example, we have a lot of low-income seniors who have small households, so 1 or 2 people, but maybe they have a 3 or 4 bedroom home. And to participate, as the city of Houston, we would like to rebuild a standard 3-bedroom home, with some exceptions. But so if you are an older couple, your kids have moved out, you had a 3 or 4 bedroom home, we'll rebuild you a 3-bedroom home as the standard rebuild size. Well, the state's rules say we will only rebuild a 2-bedroom home for 2-person households. So we say, okay, we'd like a waiver of your requirements. And they say, well, HUD has to sign off on the waiver of our requirements. And HUD says, well, we don't care how many bedrooms you build, so the state of Texas can do whatever it wants. And the state of Texas says, we're not doing anything unless we get assurances that HUD is not going to recapture funds from the city of Houston. So meanwhile, we're covering, I don't know if it's a relatively small amount, maybe tens of thousands of dollars difference from a 2- to 3-bedroom home. That's being covered by local dollars until we get resolution between HUD and the state of Texas. So it gets very complicated very quickly and very boring. One of the challenges is that this stuff is hugely important and is very hard to imagine before it's important to you. And so for political leadership, getting into the nuances of HUD Federal Register notices and waiver requirements and LMI and everything else that we've been talking about is, it's hard to inspire around those things. In this period before, what anybody cares about is how quickly are we going to help people? And you have to back up so many steps and so long, get your political leadership and all these different levels of government to work together to anticipate the staffing needs and all of that in this long period between the disaster event and when you can actually start helping people.
So one question, you just started to touch on this a bit, but in the interim, before the funding arrives, what are some of the ways that you were able to see more low-cost, local-driven response from your side? What worked to fill that gap before things started to actually move, since you say it's such a long process?
So we raised a ton of money privately. So there was a huge philanthropic response to Harvey, and it was bigger than any of the subsequent storms because we were really on the front end of that. If you remember the summer of 2017, we were in August, but then in September and I think October, you had this other series of storms. But there was huge risk. Harvey was on the news for like a week, apparently. I didn't remember any of that because we were like in recovery mode. But J.J. Watt raised a ton of money. Red Cross raised a ton of money. United Way. And the county judge, was our county executive, and the mayor of Houston set up a fund to kind of manage that philanthropic response. And the pressure on the philanthropic funds will be to push it out the door as quickly as possible. And politically, it will seem like we got to spend this money quickly to really show that we're responding. And that will seem like a good idea in the first instance, and then a bad idea a year and a half later when you still don't have the HUD money that you thought you were going to have because it takes so long to get here, and philanthropic resources have been spent down, and you're in a kind of painful waiting period. I don't know if you can resist the pressure around that, the pressure to show results, to spend. The nonprofits will have capacity, but not nearly enough to scale and not nearly enough to help the people who are most affected. So most nonprofits will be able to do some rebuilding, but when it gets to a full reconstruct, they'll tell people that they have to wait for the HUD program. And that's very challenging because those are the people who are often the most vulnerable. The other nonprofit stuff. We had really incredible response from the nonprofits, but we're now in this kind of painful period where they've mostly spent down the funds, and we have not yet fully scaled the full HUD program.
I wonder if you have any observations about the type of housing. Again, in Seattle right now, most of our housing is single-family detached or multifamily housing, but we are trying to encourage more attached housing. We have a very unusual style of townhouse here where people actually share a wall, but there's no HOA that governs that. I always wonder how that's going to work out in a disaster scenario. Or trying to encourage more backyard cottages. So is there anything that you've learned about how different kinds of housing stock might evolve during a disaster and a recovery period?
My observation is that so I guess it's sort of like any innovation. There's a lot of chatter, like innovation is very exciting to people, and people love to talk about like there's a concrete swirl house they're going to pour, and all, like I'm always being invited to demos of like exciting new like things, innovations in building construction, and the reality is that we're going to rebuild like 4,000 or 5,000 homes. The cheapest way to rebuild them in Houston is it's not modular. It's just labor is pretty cheap. Like we can just put together houses pretty quickly. So my experience has been that the innovation drives the design community, and then there's the builder community that is like, how do we build at scale quickly? And there's some tension between those two, and hopefully there's some overlap between those two. From a permitting perspective, also, if you're trying to do lots of homes at once, having a set of designs that have been vetted with the community that, we work with a local or a Texas-based organization called BC Workshop, Building Community Workshop, that's a mix of architects and urban planners who've come in and done a couple of rounds of community feedback over several storms about home design, so that we've got pre-positioned sets of design that homeowners can choose from, that you can expedite through the permitting process, and that builders can do at scale. I'm also, I think, in our program, we're not so surprised by this anymore, but particularly for your very low income homeowners, a lot of the work ends up flipping from a rehab to a reconstruct. And you can set caps. So for our program, I think the cap is $85,000. If you have, and again, context for home prices in Houston, our median home price, I think, just went to $300,000. So take these numbers, do the math in your own head about median home prices in Seattle. But you know, how much? What's the cap on your program? How much are you willing to spend on a rehab? I was talking to a contractor the other day who said they were doing $1 million rehabs on Long Island. And in our program, that would not be an acceptable use of funds. That if you demand more than $85,000 worth of work, then we flip you to a reconstruct. And you know, having some knowledge and familiarity about what does your population look like, how many people are you going to serve, and are you going to be doing mostly rehab, mostly reconstruct? If you're doing reconstruct, what kinds of designs do you want to use? How do you want to engage the design community in developing those standards?
Thanks. I had a question about risk reinsurance companies like Swiss Re in terms of the funding stream and the funding gap, whether you all had a contract with a company like that, and when that money comes in, how flexible it is, and does it fill space in that year-and-a-half period?
We do not. Anything that we, and Krista may have more insight into the specific rules of pre-spending, sort of what are eligible expenses. I know we have a couple people from finance in the room too. You guys are going to be super important in all of this, figuring out what is a reimbursable expense. So we still get at City Council, people are like, our City Council members are like, well, when are we getting the check from HUD for $1 billion? HUD does not give you a check for $1 billion. HUD authorizes you to draw down on those funds with lots of documentation. So as an example, we're doing home repair now, and the application for home repair, our partners at the state have just come back with a requirement that we screenshot every single link on the desktop environmental review to the tune of 65 pages of screenshots in a 200 or 300 page application. That is the level of detail, of oversight, of concern for fraud, waste, and abuse, and also the environment, that HUD is paying attention to. And at the same time that HUD Congress appropriated money to the states for Harvey recovery, they also appropriated money to HUD to staff up. So they appropriated $10 million to the office within HUD that manages disaster recovery. And they also appropriated $10 million to HUD OIG to monitor that office in their implementation of the funds. So the risk on pre-spend, and this again goes to that urge to speed it up, is that if you haven't signed the contract with HUD, you don't totally know what the reimbursable eligible expenses are. So there's always risk in pre-spend, and it depends on what level of funding you have, what level of risk tolerance you have in your local or state budgeting capabilities to float money, understanding that not all of that may be reimbursable. It's a barrel of laughs,
As long as we're depressing, this might be a good time to dispel the myth about the individual assistance program of the Stafford Act as well.
Which myth? Or
never mind. Krista just volunteered to do it when she gets up there. You've taken enough.
Okay, great. Yeah, no. Which painful aspect of this program are we talking about? Yeah, and just to kind of give a little, to turn to this for a minute, this is kind of a little timeline of the last year. So this is year 2 after the disaster. And hopefully it feels a little bit more comprehensible now that we've had this discussion about the Cdbg DR framework. But you'll see a lot of milestones on here that don't seem very significant on their face and kind of boring, like the state submits Amendment 1 to their action plan. Super important milestone in terms of accessing that money and the ability to draw down funds. But what you'll see is that I think it was in January, or is it late December, that HUD approved our action plan essentially as Amendment 1 to the state's plan. And then we launched the recovery 2 weeks later. We did a big event at a housing resource center. I think particularly for a local jurisdiction, my experience coming from the federal government into local government, it is so much more intimate. And we've just walked through the many different stages between you helping people and where the money comes from. People don't really care or know about all those stages. And so people expect city government more than county government, more than state government. Those are your political leaders. Those are people, people will call their city council member more than they will call George P. Bush, who's our general land office commissioner, because it is intimate and it is city. So I think the role of a city in this kind of disaster is really important, and you have nowhere near as much control as people think you do, but you have lots of accountability for their experience. And so our program has moved more quickly than the county program. The county is probably a few months behind us. And no one seems to care about that, but they really care about the pace of our program. So we get lots of scrutiny. And the political pressure to move the first group of homes through your recovery program is so intense, and you won't be ready because you don't know how all the systems are going to line up, and if the state of Texas is going to give you a waiver on the bedroom requirements, or if they're going to go back to HUD, and all this stuff can slow you down. So you've got to push through the first set of homes while you're building a program that can scale to 4,000 or 5,000 homes in our case. And those are almost unrelated activities because you've got to test all these choke points with the first few homeowners. And that's everything from, the screenshots of the environmental review to permitting to contractor selection, just so many different aspects. The communication, what are you saying to homeowners at different points? And then, how do you do 1,000 homes in a year? Yeah.
Hi. Particularly with our aging population, something that we think about, or at least I think about a lot around here, is accessibility. And I see that in two different ways, both accessibility of individual homes or multifamily units, and also universal design as it applies to rebuilding infrastructure and public spaces. I'm wondering what your experience was in your area, and are there helps and or barriers within all of that funding that can help get us there?
We found AARP to be a great partner. Interestingly, they've got great national networks. They've focused a lot on universal design. And the way that we do, ramps and bars in the bathrooms and stuff like that, it's a plus up. So if the base for home repair is, there's a $200,000 cap or something if we're reconstructing a home, you can do add-ons for lead abatement, mold abatement, and also for accessibility. So you can structure your program in that way. And then same thing with, with public spaces, Krista may be able to talk more about the FEMA public assistance program, but if you have, in our case, City Hall, municipal courts, libraries, a bunch of stuff went down during the storm. That's often through a public assistance portion of the FEMA program, not through the HUD housing program. So you'll have lots of different things that will need money. And understanding what are the federal sources and what are the matching requirements in order to make those repairs, I think is important to have that understanding. One other thing I would say though, so the outreach for our housing program, we did a very concerted push. We did a mix of strategies designed to reach people who are low income, elderly, have disabilities. So it's available online, and that's fine. But we stood up 4 housing resource centers around the city that are staffed like 6 days a week. We did a door-to-door canvas. We've knocked 172,000 doors or something since January. Again, using that data to target areas that were heavily impacted and have high social vulnerability. We did a print and social media and radio advertising campaign to reach people who may not be online, or to reach people on social media to encourage them to apply. And we did a ton of community events. So I think we've participated in 150 events. It's like, I forget the exact number, but it's a lot of community events where we've got a mobile team that will go out and encourage people to express interest in the program. So the outreach piece is also really important, but again, challenging when you're a year and a half after the storm. So you'd love to be able to do the outreach right after the storm, but you don't know what your programs are going to look like because you haven't signed the contract with HUD until a year and a half later. So it's somewhat overcoming a fair amount of resistance or fatigue at the point when you are finally able to start helping people.
Kind of follow up on a question on the communication. I lived through the Loma Prieta earthquake years ago, so I recall some of the fun times we had there with the city being leveled and not hearing any communication from our city, really. Of course, we didn't have the internet back then like we do now. What things did you guys do to communicate to the population that things were happening still? And it might seem silent, but what are you doing, and what can the cities do to communicate to the people that are waiting to hear what's going on?
Never enough is part of the answer. And I was having a conversation with some advocates. One of the things I did when I came into the housing department was I set up a regular meeting with advocates. And that was not something we had done before. And so when we did the first round of community engagement, we did it in partnership with advocacy groups, which was I don't know what it may be different here. It was not typical in Houston to have grassroots community organizing groups working in partnership with the city to put on a community event, getting input about recovery. But in the process of that, I think we did strengthen relationships with those groups and create a forum where we could share information with them regularly. I would not say that they are fully persuaded that things are going great. We still get a fair amount of criticism, but that was, I think, a good communication channel. We also we've used the media, and we have weekly city council meetings, which have been another place to share information. I will say that, and this may be a cultural difference, I think some of this stuff is very exciting, some of the reports and plans that we did. From a public perspective, people really care about when are you going to start helping people. And so balancing the communication about, how much are we doing, are we studying the problem, and how much are we doing about the problem. So that's been, you have to calibrate that it's great to do studies and plans. But when is the money going to get here? When do we get our $1 billion check from HUD? Yeah.
I don't know, Mike. Do you have an idea of how many households permanently relocated from Houston, just given the time frame that you've laid out here, 2 years, and especially with flooding, where you have issues of mold, because it becomes immediately a health and safety issue. So do you have an idea of how many people just decided we're just going to move elsewhere in the country?
I don't have great data on that, and what is most concerning to me is we have a lot of people who didn't move, who remain in truly horrible conditions. I've been out just in the last couple of weeks at homes that are in really bad shape, no running water. And for us, for some people, this is their third, fourth, fifth storm. And so people are just sort of passive. And we've had to stand up a special team that does very high touch engagement to get people to actually apply for assistance. So that's been our bigger problem, is that people stay in in homes with mold, without walls, without holes in the roof, that sort of thing. Last question, I think.
So connecting to that is, how have you handled the repetitive loss properties?
And we only do voluntary buyout. So buyout buyout is actually handled by our county counterparts, but they have some interesting data too about the interest in, so if your home is repeatedly flooded, you are a good candidate for buyout. And they have targeted areas for buyout that are likely to flood. And the challenge is, when does the money arrive for that? And are you able to pre-position a program? Because the most likely time for people to accept a buyout is right after the disaster event. But we're still waiting, we've still got negotiations going on with FEMA about buyout from Harvey. So, the money the money doesn't sync up with when people are most likely to raise their hand and say, yes, I'd like a buyout. And so there's some talk about pre-positioning private funds, other funds, so that you could buy people out in the time when they're most likely to accept it. Last one. Okay.
Just a
Truly the
quick
last
one.
one.
What would you do if you had an earthquake a year out? What are some concrete things that you would do as a city to instill confidence from the state or the feds in your draft action plan? Or just maybe if you could talk about what actual ways you would need to move forward to improve the relationship that you talked about earlier that's so important. I was just wondering if you had any examples of what you'd recommend.
I would start by standing up a team of people who are focused on this piece of it. And the education piece at the political level, understanding what are all of the levers that are available to you or potentially available to you so that you're able to pull them at the right moment. One of the first things that so I started at the city in February of 2018, so right as the Federal Register notice came out. And coming from Washington, I read the Federal Register notice very carefully because this is the way that government is speaking to each other, kind of. And the Federal Register notice gave us a bunch of rights as a city that was up to us to invoke. So the state was obligated to consult with local jurisdictions in the development of their action plan. And when the state did not do that, we launched a procedural objection to say, you have to consult with us. And also we want a quarter of the money. And we all went to HUD and we negotiated with the state and with HUD so that we would control a quarter of the money, Harris County would control a quarter of the money, and the state would run the program in the area outside of Houston and Harris County. And that's how we have more than $1 billion to kind of control our own destiny about the recovery. But that's a very kind of tactical, there's so much about this that is not preordained. And you don't know what the playing field looks like. You have some idea of where the lines are and maybe what the goalposts, where they are, but you don't really know what the distance is. You don't know what the rules of the game are. And having people at multiple layers, so you need technical experts, you need political leadership, and people in between to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. And I think that it's one of the things that is very unsettling about this is that there is no playbook and there is no expert who is better prepared to handle this than you are. And I think that can be a hard thing to kind of appreciate sometimes because you think there must be somebody we can call to tell us what to do. And it turns out that all of this is so, there's lots of history that can inform you and practice and that sort of thing. But preparing for that kind of uncertain operating environment, creating a team that has those connections up and down from the technical to the political, getting some familiarity with Washington. In Houston, Washington feels very far away. And I don't know what the attitudes about Washington are here, but it matters if you show up at HUD and have meetings with them pretty regularly so that they know who you are and have confidence that you know what you're doing. And those kinds of relationships are best built over time. The other thing I would do is what you're doing now, which is create relationships with the people you can pick up the phone and call. Because if anyone can tell you, answer the question, what should I be doing now? It's other jurisdictions that have gone through this. And so creating those relationships so that you can lean on them when you need them and you're making tough choices or even figuring out what you don't know, that's really important as well.
Sarah, if I can add to that excellent answer, since it does come from our Director of the Office of Intergovernmental Relations, two things I think that we can be doing right now. So as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, we have developed the skeleton of a disaster recovery framework. Later this year, we hope to appoint public and private co-chairs to each of the emergency or the recovery support functions. And that's where we get a chance to get all those different experts that you just mentioned, Sarah, at the table talking through. And then secondly, it's exercising. It's throwing a couple scenarios on the table and say, okay, seriously, 24,000 homes. Now what? And start talking our way through it. We're going to give Sarah a chance to get some water, and if anybody else needs something stronger to drink as a result of what it is you've heard, we're going to take a 15-minute break, but the second half is equally informative and inspiring, so come back in 15 minutes. And because this is a 4-level government kind of experience, we are thrilled to have with us Christa López from the Texas General Land Office, who's going to touch on many of the same aspects from a much wider range. So the same thing, she's got some incredibly informative slides that she's going to use, but she too has been taking notes on questions that have come up that she's got special expertise to answer. At the point that she is finished in about an hour, we're going to take a very quick stretch break again, but then we're going to ask both Christa and Sarah to end the day with time to be specifically in conversation about anything that came up on your minds that you'd like them to talk about. So with that, take it away, Christa.
Okay. All right, am I on? Yep. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am humbled truly to be here. Anytime I can share our experience with other folks just makes it a little bit easier for that next person down the road. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about what we were tasked with. The Texas General Land Office is a unique state agency to the state of Texas. I did research because when I started working for them, I had no clue what they did. And I also didn't know if anyone else did what they did, and they don't. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to the point of Harvey. So 5 days before Hurricane Harvey hit, I was in San Antonio speaking to a group of folks about individual assistance from the state level, human services. I was working for the Texas Division of Emergency Management, so our state OEM, focused on human services. Harvey hit, was approaching. Somebody pulled me out of that meeting from Fema, one of our partners, and said, hey, come listen to this weather brief. And by Tuesday, we were like, okay, we think we have a hurricane coming. By Wednesday, for those of you who are familiar with planning, for hurricanes, we do H-hour clocks. So, we were 120 hours, and we were ready to go for this hurricane. And then all of a sudden, we went from 120 hours to 48 hours. The storm intensified very quickly. So we had little time to prepare for what was about to come. So I'm going to show you a couple slides about what those first few days look like and how it impacted the state. So I say 60 inches of rainfall in Houston. It's 54, it's 60, it's somewhere in that span because it was a lot of rain. It was just a lot in a very short period of time. I live in Austin, so I'm 3 hours away from Houston to give you perspective. And for 4 days, it rained at my house. At some point, because I was working 17 hours a day, my husband called and said, we lost the roof to the gazebo because we still had Cat 1 hurricane winds in Austin. So 3 hours away from the coast, we still had Cat 1 hurricane force. And so it was 4 days after we lost the roof to our gazebo, we realized it landed on the roof of our house. It was raining that much and that hard that I couldn't even see it. So perspective, we had at least 80,000 homes in this state with at least 18 inches of water. I was in Montgomery County, which is northwest of Houston, following the storm, and talking to homeowners who had 16 feet, 17 feet of water in their houses. We had almost 780 Texans evacuate from their houses. So when you think about mass care and sheltering and human service needs, that's a lot of people to take care of who are displaced all over the state. And I know there were some questions about people being displaced and who moved back and who didn't, and I can answer some of that as well. 80% impacted homes did not have flood insurance. So think about that. Let's think about Seattle. How many homes do you think have earthquake insurance? Everybody's shaking their heads right now, right? It's that same thing. Now, shamefully, I'm going to say, we know we flood, and we flood often. You know, I get that hesitation here of, you know, is it really going to happen in my lifetime? Do I want to spend this amount of money on earthquake insurance for something that may or may not happen? But we get it. I mean, we had, since 2015, we had 7 federal declarations, all of which 5 or 6 were flooding events. So we know better. But we still, again, it's a privilege thing too, right? Like, who has the money, who can afford that extra insurance? So I get that, but we know better. Our direct housing mission projection, so this is a temporary housing, kind of intermediate housing program that FEMA usually provides. Our projections were that we were going to have to service 32,000 households. I'll show you a slide later. We met about 4,000, and I'll talk to you about why that was. Timing within the hurricane season, so Harvey, August 25th, Irma, September 10th, Maria, September 20th. So going into Harvey, FEMA told us we are already short-staffed. We know we are. That's the reality of where we are as an agency right now. And then they had 2 subsequent major disasters in the country. So resources were stretched thin. Again, how we got to what we did in the GLO. And like I said, in 2016 alone, we had 4 major disaster declarations as a result of flooding. Harris County, Houston, they had 3 500-year floods in 3 years. So when people say it's not going to happen here or not in my lifetime, I am here to tell you it will. I shared yesterday that I spoke with the Emergency Management Director for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and she shared with us that they had exercised a Category 5 hurricane affecting the U.S. Virgin Islands. What they didn't plan for was 2 Category 5 hurricanes affecting the U.S. Virgin Islands 10 days apart. So their plan, their catastrophic plan, was to move their medical evacuees during their Cat 5 hurricane to Puerto Rico. So they did that during Irma. Do I have to tell you what happened during Maria? All their medical evacuees then got shipped to the mainland out of Puerto Rico, and they had no idea where they are. Where are my public health people? Does that scare you? Like, planning for housing includes all of these folks. Planning for the folks with medical needs, your elderly population, your at-risk, your vulnerable populations, your children. Not to go down a rabbit hole, but think about the mental health needs and behavioral health needs of your community if they've been affected 3-4 times over. I can't tell you the countless parents I talked to who said, when we got home and we had the first rainstorm after Harvey, my kids were crying in the corner because they thought we were going to lose our house again. Because that's what kids in Texas equate rain to right now, is I'm going to lose my house again. So, and this all happened the same week kids were supposed to go back to school, by the way. So we also had to deal with education system and getting people transferred to different schools in amongst the housing need. So again, landfall was the 25th. September 7th, the state of Texas requested a housing mission from FEMA. So when there's a disaster that hits, the state OEM writes a letter to FEMA. It's a long letter. I write that often. But they write a letter basically saying we need individual assistance, public assistance, or a declaration request. That declaration request is the first thing that gets money flowing out the door and assistance from the federal government. It's only if you can show that you have a need beyond the capability of the state. And so the locals give us their request at a local jurisdiction level, and then the state turns that into the state to federal request. If a direct housing mission is warranted or requested, that has to follow up after that disaster declaration. So we asked for a housing mission, and then September 10th, it was authorized, and Irma struck Florida, and FEMA turned around and said, hey, state of Texas, we're kind of busy right now. I know we've never done this, but would you run this housing mission for us? Because we just don't have the capabilities to do so, and we'd like to try and get states to be more involved in this mission. So in the middle of a major disaster, we were asked to take on a housing mission that would temporarily house people between when disaster struck and when Cdbg DR funds kick in. There's no rules for that. There was no guideline set for that. So the state of Texas then entered an intergovernmental service agreement, or the IGSA, with FEMA. That was our contract. Instead of a grant, we did a contract on September 13th. Between the 14th and the 21st, this is that timeline stuff that Sarah was talking about that nobody gets to see. They just want to see, did you put somebody in a house? No, we have to do all this first. So between the 14th and the 21st, we had discussions with FEMA and other agencies talking about all the other documents we had to write to support being able to carry out this mission. Then the 20th comes in there and Maria makes landfall. And then we finally signed that IGSA on September 22nd. So almost a month after Harvey hit, we finally signed the contract with FEMA to house people on a temporary basis. The 29th, the direct housing mission operations began. So what happened to the people between August 25th and the 29th? Shelters were open across the state. And the state also requested from FEMA to turn on the Temporary Shelter Assistance Program, or TSA. TSA, most people call it the hotel voucher program. And for Harvey, households that were eligible for TSA, which there were a whole lot. And at beginnings, the initial vetting for that was pretty lax. That program, we had people in all 50 US states. So it's not like they go to a hotel in Texas and they stay in Texas. We have folks in Florida, which then got evacuated because of Irma. We have folks in, North Carolina, South Carolina. We have folks here in Seattle. We have folks in Alaska and Hawaii as well. So we have folks spread out all across the state until we could start to whittle and bring them back into the state to say, okay, the TSA program is shrinking. If you want to be eligible, you need to move closer to Texas. Okay, now you need to be in Texas. And so that program itself takes on a whole new form. We could spend days talking about that. I'm not going to. I can't cover mass care right now. But just to give you a perspective, that's what was happening up to this point. October 5th, we had our management plan approved, and then October 7th was the first temporary housing unit under this FEMA program that was provided to a household in place. Then we saw an implementation plan, an administrative plan to do, and then the 13th through the 26th, FEMA and GLO met with all the councils of governments, including the City of Houston, to help us administer this program. Each council of government represents a certain body of counties in Texas. Do you have COGs here? Regional planning commissions? Okay. So our COGs and our regional planning commissions are the ones that helped us primarily administer, and then City of Houston also stepped in to help us with that. One, span of control. Two, our local jurisdictions know our permitting offices and our local jurisdictions better, so it's more helpful to have them involved in this process. And then on November 17th, we finally had all the documentation that they wanted. But we weren't stopping progress. We still needed to provide housing to people in the interim, so FEMA worked with us on how this flowed. So we have 49 counties that received, just some numbers, that received the Presidential Disaster Declaration to receive Cdbg DR. So for the housing mission, the temporary housing mission under FEMA, we had 31 counties allowed. Under Harvey, we had 49. 34 trillion gallons of water, 30 30% of Texas population was affected. So that's a huge portion of the state affected. Louisiana was also impacted by it. So thinking about resources, when the big one hits here, you may not be able to call on the next county over or the next 10 counties over to provide assistance. BC may not be able to help you. Oregon may not be able to help you because they too may be faced with the same things you're faced with. So think about who your mutual aid agreements are with. Think about, can you EMAC? So for the TSA program, I EMAC'd, or Emergency Management contracted someone from Arizona to come help me run that program because I need to reach far enough to an unaffected area to pull someone in to help us run that. And $125 billion in damages to homes, infrastructure, businesses, and so forth. And those are just preliminary estimates. Those have changed over time. This is the big numbers. And I know this is really, really small, but trying to fit it all on one slide is difficult. So we had 581,000 referrals to the Small Business Administration for disaster loans, and that's for businesses or homeowners, and renters can also apply for their personal property. We had over $2 billion, almost $3 billion in those loans approved. Now, not everybody takes those loans, so that number also changes. Individual assistance, they had $1.6 billion in IA, FEMA funded, IA money approved and dispersed. But think about that. 1.6 billion sounds like a lot, but when you have over 800,000 households registered for FEMA, the challenge with IA assistance is the federal government is not set up to make households whole again. And one of the big lessons learned is we must message often, early, frequently with internal and external partners to set expectations. You will never be able to repair your house on the money that FEMA provides. It is a great resource, but it will never provide a full fix. The max grant award, I'm looking at my FEMA partner right now, is $34,900 this year. Is that right? So $34,900 is the max grant an individual household can get. That is if, based on your income, based on the amount of damages done to your house, the fact that you don't have adequate insurance to cover it, all these other factors, that you would be able to get that. How many people can repair their house, rebuild completely for $34,900, right? No one here. I can't. There are very few people who get that max grant. The average in Texas was about $4,000 per household. So if you are working with folks and working on messaging and communication, the key is the federal government will not be able to make you whole again. That's not the intention of the program. So the reality is you all in the room have to come up with solutions to make that happen, because it's not a one fix. It might be FEMA with Cdbg, with SBA, with voluntary agency assistance. I heard Red Cross was here and some other NGO partners. Like, that's how people get whole again. And insurance is the #1 key, because that is truly the best solution. But again, if you're looking at at-risk populations, they don't typically have insurance or don't have adequate insurance to cover their losses. So our direct housing mission, I'm going to tell you what that program entailed in just a second, but we served a total of 35,009 households throughout. So I said initially we thought we were going to have 32,000 households be eligible. In order to be eligible, FEMA determines eligibility for this mission. You had to have a FEMA verified loss of $17,000 or greater. That was the baseline threshold. Then you still had to have a temporary housing need. So FEMA did all the vetting, and so when they would call households to say, do you have a need? If someone said, I'm good right now, I'm living with my sister, or I'm back with my parents, then they were housed, right? So they didn't have a housing need. Now I'm here to tell you, I love my family, but 2 months with them would be my max. So we have folks that are still rebuilding. You heard Sarah talk about houses are still covered in mold and in deplorable conditions. love my family, but I can't do 2 years with them. I try really hard, but I can't. So folks' needs initially looked different, sounded different than what they are today. And they continue to evolve through today and will be for the next year or two. We had an MHU and RV program. Again, I'll explain these, and that's the breakdown there. We had direct lease applicants, and then we had dollar applicants. I'm going to tell you about those programs in just a second. But here's some numbers to think about. In this program, and I told you 3,500 was served, 2,800 of them were owners. So the program does serve renters, but not to the extent that it serves owners. When you have a 50-50 ratio or 51-49, and you have a large renter population, think about what you're going to do for them. Think about, a lot of these programs just aren't even feasible in a city. So we got the permitting and allowance within City of Houston to start this program in February. And part of that reason was figuring out, can we fit a travel trailer in someone's driveway in the city? Right. They had to pass an ordinance. I had to go to every single county, every city within the counties to figure out what was their permitting for this program. Would they allow it? I talked to the utility folks here because one of our challenges too was all of our utility providers. So when you place a temporary housing unit on someone's property, you also have to place a temporary power pole. And what they wanted in Harris County or City of Houston as far as where that power box was located off the ground differed from Beaumont, from Port Arthur, from Rockport, the list goes on. So we had this report from Fema that we called the GAR, green, amber, red. And green was like, we're good to go, we can place property or a temporary unit there. Amber was like, well, maybe we can, maybe we can't, not too sure. And red was like, not going to happen. So for the longest while, that sheet was almost all red because we didn't know what the permits were going to be or if they were going to allow it. A lot of city ordinances say no temporary housing units, no mobile units, whatever. And then if you take yourself a little bit further out of the city into the suburbs, in Texas, we have a lot of HOAs. Do you have a lot of HOAs, homeowners associations here? Iffy. So Montgomery County, again, outside City of Houston, and where a large portion of people who work in the City of Houston actually live, in that county alone, we have 405 HOAs. So not only did I have to understand the permitting rules, but then I had to understand the power pole rules, and then I also had to understand the HOA rules. So Montgomery County Office of Emergency Management went to every HOA. I gave them address by address who might be eligible, and they found out, could this house have one? Could this house have one? And they provided me back a list. So coordination with local and state is absolutely essential. You will not be able to succeed in a program if you're not talking to each other and on a regular basis, because you will lean on each other back and forth all the time. I also had cities and counties that didn't want this program because of what happened in Hurricane Ike, because of what happened in Hurricane Katrina. Everybody talked about FEMA trailers, and they did not have a good name. Those programs have changed a lot, and they look different now. And so the EMC from Montgomery County actually came to visit me at the Joint Field Office with FEMA. And one of the best practices we had was we had a demo of a temporary housing unit, both a mobile home and a travel trailer in the parking lot. And I walked him out there and said, Darren, cut me some slack here. He's former law enforcement. I'm a former firefighter, so I'm going to pick on law enforcement for a second. So, former law enforcement, he's like, I don't like this stuff. These things. I saw what happened in Katrina. I saw what happened. I was like, just walk with me, please. So we walked around the unit. I showed him what they look like, and he went, oh, I could do this now. I'll talk to the judge. Well, but it took that type of relationship. And if I didn't know Darren from all the past storms we had and my relationships with him when I was with the emergency management agency for the state, it would not have flown. So you should not be exchanging business cards when your disaster strikes or after. You should know each other now. As Sarah talked about, you have a disaster and you're in response mode. And quickly you're thinking about short-term housing, which is your temporary sheltering, which is your big mega shelters, small shelters, your hotel assistance, and so forth. And then comes the intermediate housing program. So I'm going to run into that real quick. That's this FEMA program we talked about. And then long-term housing, which is Cdbg DR and beyond. Now I'm talking federally funded programs here. There are a lot of amazing NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations that do incredible work from the beginning of a disaster. And I always say they're the last ones out the door. So I do not want to discredit that they play a role in all of these as well. So again, short-term housing, it's coordinated typically through Emergency Services Function 6 or ESF 6, mass care. I'm not going to hit on this too much. That's a whole couple weeks of dialogue there. And again, temporary shelter assistance is only if the state requests it, if FEMA determines it's needed. And some considerations are, when should you request it? We requested it right away, and we learned that was a big mistake. Because we requested it so soon, we did have people all across the U.S. We couldn't address wraparound services, human services needs, and so forth. And we couldn't really get an idea of how many people were affected and where are they. And, you know, our homeless population also shifted from City of Houston and Beaumont and so forth into Austin and Fort Worth. And we didn't have time to plan for wraparound services for that population and helping them as they transition to new communities. So this is something all to talk about as well. Real quick, the sheltering that is provided is typically covered under FEMA public assistance. So when you have TSA, that's a cost share to the state. Now that cost share can always be passed down to the local jurisdiction. That's part of FEMA programs on PA, public assistance. So emergency protective measures under public assistance through FEMA does come with a cost share. For Harvey, ours started at 90-10, but typically it's a 70-30 or 75-25 split. So think about your agency might also have to help foot a bill for some of these things you're asking for. We had TSA going from when Harvey hit through spring of 2018. So whatever FEMA paid in footing the bill for those hotel rooms every single night for every single household, we at the state also had to share that cost. Now, Cdbg DR can sometimes be used for federal matching. So we were able to use Cdbg DR funding to match some of our FEMA cost share on PA. So when folks start to talk about how do you make this work, there's some tools there. Individual household programs, this is direct money that goes to households, and those are some of the subcategories under IHP, under FEMA's IA program, that households can cover for. I skipped a bullet. STEP, shelter at home, we called it PREPS. Camping in your house, whatever you want to call it, which is what we called it, even though we were running the program, is no longer an option on the table from FEMA. We have been informed it will never be used again. Now, I always say never, because if something catastrophic happens, somebody might change their mind, but right now that program's not on the board. But because people across the country are familiar with it, because New York did it, and Puerto Rico did it, and we did it, and Louisiana's done it, folks may ask for that program. I want you to be aware it's not available at this time. And this was another one of those cost shares that we ended up paying the cost share out of Cdbg funds to cover for the state. So the direct housing mission. FEMA provided the funding and technical support, and our office, the General Land Office, administered that program with the help of the COGS in the City of Houston. So as I mentioned, we have 525 households that had dollar. This was direct assistance for limited home repair. The STEP program was supposed to be temporary fixes in their house, like a temporary sink, a temporary bathroom, drywall, and so forth. I call dollar, FEMA calls it PHC, permanent housing construction. I call it STEP on steroids, really. That's kind of the way I can equate it and describe it. It doesn't give homeowners the high-end finishes they want. So if they had granite countertops, we're putting Formica back in. If they had hardwoods, we're putting laminate back in. But at least it provides flooring, it provides drywall, and somewhat of a reconstruct of their house. There are limitations to it. MHUs and RVs, MHUs are manufactured housing units, and then direct lease, I'll explain a little bit more about that, but that's basically apartments provided. All of this, just so you know, the General Land Office had never administered, no one had ever administered, because FEMA's always done it. So I forgot to share with you how I ended up from Division of Emergency Management to GLO. So in amongst all this stuff happening, and the governor said, yeah, we'll run that program for you, FEMA. Hey, by the way, General Land Office, you're running this program. The GLO was also told they could take anyone from any state agency they wanted. I was stolen. So in amongst trying to run an IA program for the state, I then got plucked up from one agency and sent to another. So I've been with the General Land Office for 2 years, but understand how all these programs flow because I used to work with FEMA on these programs. Prior to Harvey, we had some other direct housing programs. So we provide assistance to eligible households. They have to be displaced by a federally declared disaster and when there are no other resources available. So if you have a disaster in your state, you won't necessarily get a direct housing mission. There's an assessment team that goes out and they look at, is there available rental properties out in the community already? Are there other temporary solutions? And if not, then FEMA will determine if a program's turned on. And just to give you an idea, in Texas, prior to Harvey, these are the 3 most recent direct housing missions we had. We did have one in March of 2016, but it was for 2 counties, 31 counties. Big difference. In 2011, we had wildfires that covered pretty much half of the state. So we have 254 counties. So it was 84 counties that the mission covered, but I do believe we had over 156 counties on fire at the same time throughout that season. It was the end of a very long drought. So Texas, you either flood or you catch fire. There's really no happy medium in our state. So we started a drought in about 2007, 2008. And it was just blazing hot and no rain for years. And in 2011, the whole state just basically felt like it erupted in fire. 2013, the patterns changed and we started to see some rain and we had some significant rainfall in Austin. And then 2015 hit. And we went from drought to flood instantly. And we are just now starting to stop raining. And so I have a fear that we have now encouraged all the fuel to grow. And we are now going to get back into that wildfire season at some point. And then Hurricane Ike in 2008. So you can see these missions don't happen often. So when you think about housing people after disasters, you may or may not have the resources you think other states have gotten. And my message is, think about what you can do within and collaboratively here without having to pull from your federal partners, because that may or may not come. So again, it was a new mission. No one's ever done it, so that's a challenge. I say we built the plane while we were flying it. Some folks say we are now building the plane after we flew it, because there's so much to learn. Everything was just in time. Just in time developing documents, just in time administering the program. Everything was at once. And one of the biggest things is data. When you are administering programs, whether it's Cdbg DR, whether it is a FEMA program, whether it's a public housing program, human services, Red Cross, everybody has their own database and none of them talk to each other. And you're not allowed to talk to each other. And you have to have all these interlocal sharing agreements to be able to say, I can send this spreadsheet to this person. And for our congressional representatives, boy, is that challenging, because you're going to have constituents calling you a lot. I mean, I know Representative White's office like the back of my hand. And when they call, I already have my agreement with them. But they have their own agreement set up in their office because they get hit up immediately. Our call center, I was trying to look at the numbers because Sarah was talking about how many calls come in every day. Our call center at the GLO right now is up to over like 3,000 or 4,000 calls a week. I think at max we're receiving 12,000 calls a week. So having a call center will be important to you all. Those type of things that all tie into housing are absolutely essential. Again, FEMA determined eligibility. The counties in blue were the ones declared by IA individual assistance from FEMA, but the ones with the stripes were the ones that were eligible for our direct housing mission. So there were more counties affected than actually were eligible even for this direct housing mission. So again, you start to whittle down who's eligible and who's not, and it's very programmatic specific, and so it changes all the time. So, you know, our folks down in, this is Clayburgh County. I had to learn how to pronounce everything in Texas. I'm not from Texas, and it's a challenge. So folks in Clayburgh, although they received individual assistance, they did not get the direct housing mission. In the 2016 floods, the city of Katy, which is outside of Houston, spans 3 counties. Do y'all have any cities that span 3 counties? 2? Okay. Who's in charge then? Both. FEMA declares by county, not by city. So in 2016, we had a flooding event. We had 3, actually, March, April, May. And in the April event, the city of Katy flooded, but only Harris County and Fort Bend County were declared. So if your neighbor lived across the street in the 3rd county, they couldn't apply for FEMA assistance, but the other 2 county folks could. So again, it becomes a challenge. It's a messaging thing. It's a communications thing. So think about that. Pre-disaster residents only. So again, all this stuff ties back to someone's pre-disaster residence. So if you have vacation homes, they don't qualify. If you have a secondary home, those don't qualify. So thinking about those factors, yeah.
Is that $17,000 limit flexible?
I wish it was. That is a standard written in policy across the board. One of the things, lessons learned that we've asked FEMA to consider is making that a percentage of damage to the residents versus a dollar amount. So for example, in Texas, we have, especially in some of our rural areas, but even in some of our cities, we have a lot of folks that live in manufactured homes or travel trailers or even temporary travel trailers. And those units themselves aren't even valued at $17,000, but they were completely destroyed. Those households weren't eligible for this. So what I'd like to see in Krista's ideal world is, you know, a percentage of, if your house is 75% loss or 80% loss, then you're automatically eligible for this program. Because I think that on an equity scale, that might work a lot better. But yeah, I wish it was flexible. So the direct assistance for limited home repair, as I mentioned, this program was a reconstruction of their home, or rebuild, not reconstruction, but a rebuild of their house. They couldn't have a structural element that was damaged. So if they lost the roof or if they lost a wall, then automatically they couldn't qualify for this program if it involved any sort of architectural engineering assessment. The cap was set by FEMA at $60,000 for repair. That includes your builder's costs, that includes materials, permit fees, everything else. The only thing that we could do above the $60,000 repair cap was if it was for access and functional needs. So we were allowed to go 25% over $60,000 if we had to build a ramp, if we had to put in grab bars, wider doorways, whatever have you. Repairs need to make the house livable, but were not covered by insurance or SBA. So if they were getting money from SBA, if they were getting money from their insurance company, what we could do was that gap. And later on when we get to Cdbg, that's what Cdbg DR is intended for, is that gap. If everything else, it's the funding of last resort is what HUD always says. If everything else didn't cover you, now we're here at Cdbg DR. This program too was similar in that fashion, that we had to look at other duplication of benefits. Any house in a special flood hazard area would not be considered for dollar. So I was talking to the state of California recently about direct housing mission because they're implementing one. And I said, this program wouldn't work for you. You have wildfire. Like, you lost walls, you lost roofs and everything. Earthquake, you're gonna lose structural elements. So this may not even be on the table for you because it's just not feasible. Manufactured homes, RVs, travel trailers, these are quick and easy. The GLO contract, we did a request for proposals and we went out to bid for buying off the lot. FEMA actually has a stock, and they have providers, and so they bring stuff in through a staging yard, and so they have certain specifications. Their units come with a TPS, or a tank and pump system. For those of you in the firefighting world will love this. All their units are sprinkled with sprinkler systems. And so it has this external shed-looking building that feeds the tank and pump system that provides water suppression in their units. It's great. It's fantastic. But now you need a bigger lot to fit this unit on. Now you need extra permitting, different water source, and it just became more cumbersome. We used, in this disaster, we kind of used a combination of our units purchased off the lot as well as FEMA units. Next mission, we've already told FEMA, we're going to buy off the lot for everyone, except for FEMA has specialized units for accessibility. We want to continue to use those, and those will come with those tank and pump. We had an applicant with a visual impairment, and he actually caught his stove on fire, and thank God that unit was sprinkled because it provided him enough time to get out safely. Those are the things that happen in this type of mission. You don't just provide somebody a temporary unit, by the way, and walk away for 18 months. You meet with them monthly. You do maintenance calls. You do preventative maintenance. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. These can't be placed in floodways. You have to make sure you have the right permitting based on jurisdiction. So there is some give and take on these type of provided units as well. Direct lease. So we also looked at non-traditional rental properties. So in City of Houston, we use direct lease a lot. So Airbnbs, corporate apartments, those units that aren't typically available to the public, FEMA sought after contracts with them to put people up in those housing units. They're great rental properties, but right now they're coming at a cost. Some of them, especially in the City of Houston, are like $4,300 a month per rent. That's a huge chunk of money. So trying to get people to come up with a permanent housing plan and finding these available may take people out of where their damaged dwelling was. So let's say they were a renter prior to the storm. Now we found them a direct lease property, but it's on the other side of the city. What impact does that have on their children's school? Where are their medical needs being met? Are there hospitals and doctors nearby? Where's their work? Do they have access to public transportation? The list goes on. So again, all of these factors, you just can't make one decision in isolation. It's a compilation of everything. We were also offered this as a resource. No apartment complex took us up on this. I don't think they will. We haven't found anybody to buy into it, but multifamily lease and repair, different than the multifamily program that's under Cdbg, by the way. But this one is basically the apartment complex goes into agreement with FEMA, and FEMA pays to rebuild the units that were damaged or destroyed or unusable at the time. But then that apartment complex, in turn, provides housing to disaster survivors for up to 12 months free of rent. So you tell me what apartment complex wants to house people free of rent. Help me find them, because I can't. It's a great program, and I love the concept. And to me, I used to go back to the apartment complexes and say, well, if you don't have the money to repair that unit, you're still at a loss for income on that unit anyway, right? So it's about messaging and figuring out ways. There are some changes out of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act from FEMA, DRRA, that did make some changes to this program. So there's a little bit more money being spent on it, a little less burden on the apartment complexes after. So there is some new legislative changes coming. This whole program will be changing legislatively after DRRA. Now, FEMA is trying to engage states to run this program like we did. So this is the new norm. So for any state partners here, you're going to be asked to do this at some point. And so think about how that might be managed. So we've gone from short-term to intermediate, and now we're at the long-term housing. And so this is where Cdbg comes in. Typically, as Sarah said, when a disaster occurs, there's a request for federal assistance, and that first request is to FEMA. And at some point, there's a request from the state to HUD for an allocation, for a federal allocation. So when the president came to town 2 days after Harvey hit, Secretary Carson also came. And so my bosses at the time got in the motorcade car with Secretary Carson and handed him a letter and said, hey, by the way, we want money now. We don't want to wait 2 years for federal appropriations. We want money now. And so we got the money a little bit faster than we probably would have normally, but again, it's still, in Sarah's timeline, it still takes all that time for a Federal Register notice and for writing action plans, and letting comment periods happen on action plans and all the iterations that occur from there. So the initial funding was that $5 billion, and it was split to the state to run for 48 counties, and then City of Houston and Harris County. There's been tons of iterations from there. The money's changing, more money's coming. There's also, in addition to all of this, money coming in for the 2016 floods, the 2015 floods, and we had a 2018 disaster in amongst this, so we're waiting on that too. So the Federal Register notice also changes for all of those. So when we're talking to, our staff is talking to local partners, it's like, okay, so you're about 2015? Was that May or October? You're talking about 2016, was that March, April, May, or are you talking about 2018 or Harvey? Because the rules are different for each of those. So again, legislatively, those are some changes we're seeking too, is to say, come on now, let's make this a little less burdensome so we can support folks and not make the rules so complicated and changing by disaster. So again, Cdbg is usually 2 to 3 years after a disaster. It doesn't come right away usually. We got it a little bit faster, but it's still never fast enough. You will still get beat up in the media for it. You will still get beat up legislatively for it. And that's the reality of it. So what I love about Cdbg-DR that FEMA doesn't allow is you can build back bigger and better. So FEMA, it's kind of a one-for-one. What was your pre-disaster look? You build back post-disaster, same thing. It's more on the public assistance side for FEMA. But again, improvements aren't part of the program. On Cdbg-DR, we can use resilient technologies. We can use innovative thought on how we want to become a little bit more resilient and implement programs like that. So for the state, our Harvey funds, we're looking at the Homeowner Assistance Program, which is basically a repair or reconstruction or rebuild program. Also under that program is our Homeowners Reimbursement Program. So let's say Barb was a survivor of Harvey and she paid out of pocket $17,000 for her repairs on her house because she used FEMA funds, she used her insurance, she used a little bit of everything, but out of pocket she still had to pay $17,000. There's a potential that Barb can apply for the reimbursement program and she gets reimbursed based on the receipts she shows that she spent money on the repair of her house. And that's not something that's, again, that's not one of those always implemented programs, but that's for our Harvey survivors going out. Buyouts and acquisitions. So the mitigation funds will likely also be put towards buyouts and acquisitions. So there's FEMA mitigation funds, right, that can be used for buyouts and acquisitions. And then there are Cdbg-DR funds that can also be used for that. Everybody understand when I say buyouts and acquisitions, the difference? Okay, so kind of some questions in the room. So buyouts is, I approach Laurel, I say we're going to buy out your house. We give her fair market value of her house. Now I, as the government, are in charge of that green space, that land, in perpetuity. We can't reconstruct on it or anything. So it does put a burden on the jurisdiction then to have to maintain that space. One of the federal partners that we're looking at working with right now and helping local jurisdictions partner with is the Department of Interior. They actually have programs for planning the use of open spaces and planning them to be resilient. So great partnership that doesn't cost anybody anything. So it helps out with the buyout program. Acquisitions are post-storm value a house, and the homeowners offered that money, but that land can be redeveloped, but it has to be redeveloped, elevated if it's a flooding situation, more resilient, and so forth and so on. So the land does get reused. So those differ a little bit. So understanding the difference of those might help you in your planning of how you want to implement those. Economic revitalization looks at how do we bring small businesses and jobs, key there, back into the community. So not just how do we rebuild businesses in our community, but also how do we bring workforce back into our community, and looking at ways to do so. Multifamily repair program, as Sarah said, really capitalize, especially in areas that have a high renter population and vulnerable populations. How do you bring those multifamily properties back online? We've got ribbon cutting ceremonies, I think, in a couple weeks for a couple that have just been rehabbed or rebuilt. And some areas we've got saturation already, City of Beaumont and so forth. But really looking at how do we provide that supply and demand. So our coastal regions were already lacking in affordable rental properties prior to the storm. So that was a consideration we knew going into the storm, that we were already going to have issues there. Local infrastructure, so there are infrastructure projects. Wastewater plants are a big one that happens in Cdbg DR money. Some roads and bridges, but most of that is covered under PA. So there are infrastructure programs. But again, as Sarah talked about that low to moderate income, you have to tie back how these projects connect to that low to moderate income, okay? And so how that's helping that community recover. And then there are also local, regional, estate planning studies. So looking at resilience studies. Right now we have some watershed studies going on. We are looking at an innovative housing solution study where not only will we, first phase is just studying. Second phase is we will actually do pilot programs. So maybe the 3D printed house or maybe so forth and so on. So we'll look at some of those and actually try them out. Just to give you an idea of kind of the breakout, and these are our COGS. So as I mentioned, that we often align and do methods of distribution for these funds related to the COGS. And then as I mentioned, we're doing studies on innovative housing solutions, and folks always ask, and I'm asking FEMA now for that temporary housing program if we can use some of these. So instead of an MHU, maybe we put a shipping container. So my team kind of looked at what was the cost range on them. Production time, right? I don't want to do an innovative housing solution if it takes longer than me buying a travel trailer or rebuilding a house. What it could be used for, and then for us, the wind zone rating, because I don't want to put temporary housing solutions out there and then another hurricane come by in the interim or a tornado come by and it's not rated for that wind zone. And then where can it be installed? On a group site like that we build, or can it fit in someone's backyard? So shipping containers were one, modular homes are an option. They're a little bit more expensive. Kit homes are also out there. There's lots out there, Rapido and some other things. And then the 3D printed houses is also an option. So I know that the owner of this software was actually in Central America building 3D printed houses when HUD did their Innovative Housing Expo a couple weeks ago on the Mall of the Capitol. So it is portable, because a lot of people are like, how do you move this thing around and print houses, right? And they're concrete, it's not like plastic. I was trying to wrap my head around the concept, I didn't get it. So quick lessons learned: reduce the complexity for disaster survivors. It is complicated because they're applying to FEMA and then they're applying to SBA, and that is a loan, so it's like going through a home closing process. Then you have to apply to Cdbg DR, and then you have to have the paperwork for this and the paperwork for that. And guess what? If your house was destroyed in a disaster, you probably don't have the paperwork, right? So then you have to work with disaster legal aid to reclaim all that paperwork and so forth. Developing a one-pager for educating disaster survivors on how to use their funds best. They get FEMA funds via direct deposit, and then FEMA sends them a letter, but that letter usually arrives in postal mail somewhere around 3 weeks later. So they've already spent their money that they've gotten in their bank account before they know how to spend it, or how to spend it to remain federally compliant and not have to have it recouped later on. Collaborate with other agencies. So we have a group called Texas AgriLife. They're our ag extension agency. I needed surge capacity on doing assessments for placing these units. They sent their ag agents out. They're already in the communities. That's where they're already officed. So they were great partners with us. We work obviously closely with Division of Emergency Management. The Texas Rebuilds Fund, so the governor sent up a rebuild account. And this is where all the donated money came into the governor's office. So then that money was managed by the Dell Foundation, and the foundation accepted grant applications, and then they divvied up the money based on regions and so forth. But I jumped in on that pretty early on. Because I've done housing missions before, I knew one of the big things was gaps. So what happens to the household that was out of their house for 6 months? They forgot to pay their utility bill or couldn't afford to pay it while they were living in Fort Worth or Austin or wherever. And then they come back to their house, and we're ready to give them a temporary housing unit, but they have to turn their power back on, and they can't afford that. So I knew that was going to happen. I saw it in the past. So I applied to the grant to cover gaps in whatever it might be. Right now I'm using the money, and I just used the last of it last week, for a lot of the households in Houston where they don't have money for first and last month's rent. They would get out of direct lease if only they had that extra money for that first and last month's rent. They can cover it from here forward. So having play money, if you're administering this program, is really helpful, and I use that fund for that purpose. I also, because I'm a state agency, I can't ask the governor's office to give us a grant. So I use the Salvation Army as my pass-through. So they administered the funds for me, and then we worked with them on the paperwork. Voluntary organizations, absolutely essential. You will always have VOEDs involved in every step of the way, and if they aren't your partner, they should be your partners now. They should be in your EOCs. They should be in every exercise or plan that you do, because your voluntary agencies will provide limitless resources. And they're amazing. Housing authorities, apartment associations, realtor associations. They're key partners for us. When we have our joint housing solutions meeting, there are partners at the table, so they can tell us what the housing stock looks like. Long-term recovery groups. After a disaster, typically FEMA, the state VALs, will come in, voluntary agency liaisons, they'll come in and help the communities establish a long-term recovery group if it's not there. That's a nonprofit group. It's a board of community members who sit and look at all the available voluntary philanthropic resources out there, and they help to distribute those at what's called an unmet needs table. They have a construction committee. They look at philanthropic donors. They go after them. These folks are absolutely amazing. I see a lot of jurisdictions use them as completely volunteer basis. I've also seen successfully where a member of the local emergency management agency sits on that board and helps run it. That to me is the ideal world, because they can share information easier. Like I can give them information, but I can't give it to the volunteers in the LTRG. But if you're a staff employee of a city or county agency, then we can. Cross-training staff early, often, having samples of temporary housing units, and coordinating between the FEMA and HUD programs. So I thought it was a crazy idea when the governor said, yes, we do it. I thought it was an even crazier idea when he gave it to GLO, who doesn't typically do anything beyond the Cdbg DR program. They don't have a lot of play with the FEMA programs. But it made sense now. Like, we got to see applicants from day one through Cdbg-GR. And even this morning, as I was checking my email, somebody from Cdbg-GR was like, hey, are these HAP applicants still in their FEMA temporary housing units? And if so, can we keep them there a little bit longer because their house is going to be finished in 2 months? That is absolutely invaluable, because then we don't have a gap in service for those households. But being able to communicate across lines is really important. And again, sharing your data is a challenge. I'm just going to leave it at that, because that is like a week-long discussion and rabbit holes. Local employers also stepped up. So we have a lot of petrochemical companies in the Houston, Galveston area. A lot of the employers actually said, I need staff to work. So in order to do so, I'm going to give them a travel trailer to put on their property. That was super amazing and really cool and really helped out a lot of people. So as I said, we only served about 4,000 households on our program, but we had lots of other people chipping in to help out households. So the need was smaller because there were other resources out there. Local universities and colleges, great volunteer base if you need extra hands. They're also amazing for research and studies and data. So why reinvent the wheel if they're already studying it, right? GIS, planning, all of that. You have folks already, young minds that are willing to absorb that information, and faculty who are willing to be a part of it, engage them on it. And I wanted to highlight Monroe County in Florida. That's the county around the Keys. They're doing some really cool stuff with a volunteer village. Because guess what? If volunteers come in to help your community, they need a place to sleep, they need a place to shower, they need a place to eat. And they're going to also absorb some of those local resources that are now competing with your disaster survivors. So these folks said, we have limited space. We're the Florida Keys. So we're going to build a volunteer village to encourage people to come, but we're going to shower them, we're going to house them, and we're going to feed them. And they're using those shipping containers to do all this. So they've got some really cool stuff. I put that link up there. Michelle Luckett is the lead of the long-term recovery group, and she's done some amazing things. So kudos to her. Lots of templates here, and shout out that top one. City of Houston, OEM, the planning team, the UASI planning team with all the surrounding counties got together and said, before Harvey, we need to build a disaster recovery planning template. And now we want to share it with the world because we finished it. I've been sitting on the advisory group with them. So this is free. So if your jurisdiction does not have a local recovery plan, here's a free plan. It's a plug and play. You can input your jurisdiction's name and information into it, and it's there for you. I always say that emergency management is 99% plagiarism, and it's completely legal and allowed. So share resources, give resources. It's great. Next link is federal disaster recovery. We always talk about FEMA, HUD, SBA. There's a lot more out there that the federal government provides. There's some resources. I had to do, so the EMPG funding that is for this, EMPG, Emergency Management Grant Preparedness Fund, funds preparedness activities throughout the year, but it comes with some stipulations this year. And one of the elements this year had to be an exercise or seminar on housing. And so I actually did a taped seminar for the state of Texas. So that's the link to that seminar, and then our report, and then some other lessons learned. I think that's it. Okay, so the first question, let me make sure this is on. Okay. So the first question was, how long were people in temporary shelters before they went into the temporary housing? Is there a solution?
So before I started working for the city, the story.
Is it on?
There we go.
It's really on now. Okay. So as Krista was describing earlier, Harvey, there's some actual similarities, I think, as you guys think about an earthquake context, that it would be very unexpected, the impact would be acute. And Harvey had some similarities to that it was unexpected in its impact. And so part of the way that I ended up working at the housing department was that during Harvey, we set up a shelter in the downtown convention center that was run by the housing director, who's my boss, who is a very competent city director, and so was tapped by the mayor to set up what they thought would be a 1,000-person shelter at the convention center. And on night one, it grew to almost 6,000, and on night two, it grew to 10,000. And so it was very unexpected and outside of the operation of any kind of OEM planning. And one of the key lessons learned out of, how do you, it's not a great idea to set up a shelter in your main economic core at your convention center. And so how do you transition out of that and prevent an uptick in post-disaster homelessness? And we piloted something with FEMA funding on post-disaster rapid rehousing to transition people out of the disaster shelter into two other shelters and do wraparound services. So we did have an uptick in post-disaster homelessness, but we think it was much lower than it otherwise would have been. And they've then taken that model, I know, to North Carolina. And we wrote a report that I can share with you called Housing for Harvey that talks about some of the lessons learned from that process. I believe the George R. Brown Convention Center closed after about 3 weeks. And then there was a transition into other kinds of post-disaster sheltering. But there was also a question about pets. One of the things I did was tag pets. There was a lot of coordination with what we call BARC, which is our local animal, animal shelter. They deal with dogs. It was profound to me how much people, they will not evacuate if they are not with their pets. People bring their pets. The pet volunteers are amazing. People really want to volunteer with pets, even more than they want to volunteer with people. But really having that as an integrated part of the sheltering operation was really important.
And I'll just add to that, in Texas, in some of the other counties, we also have a large rural population, and not everybody in Texas owns a horse, but some people do, and they own cattle. And so we also had to think about livestock sheltering, and actually had to EMAC in some cowboys on a different disaster because we had to round up cattle. And so if you've ever put out a request to other states for cowboys, come talk to me because it's kind of fun. But the sheltering need went from the temporary shelter, the mega shelters, into the transitional shelter assistance, which did last for months and months. But we sent the TSA staff with Fema into the shelters, the mega shelters, to assess people's needs to get them into the hotels and so forth. So it really was a phased approach. The next one, we talked about the animals already. And then there was a question about relaxation or modification of building codes to expedite recovery. And we really tried to steer away from that simply because we want folks to rebuild in a more resilient manner, because we don't want to see this to continue on and on. The challenge is if you relax them, then that household, especially in a flooding situation or potentially in an earthquake, may get rezoned after 6 months, 12 months after the storm, and then they're forced to rebuild the house again and maybe take away everything they just spent money on. So we try to avoid that at all circumstances because it will come at a cost to the jurisdiction and to the households later on. So that's it. And then,
Just on that point, we actually increased the zoning in Houston, as I said, four-letter word, but we actually increased the building code requirements after Harvey, the elevation requirements. And one of the important things after a disaster is that I do think it changes the political consciousness, at least in that first 6 to 12 months, around what people, if you all are having issues with the, what is it called? URM, yes. And there may be a lack of political will on the front end. You may find the political will to increase the resilience of those buildings afterwards. So it doesn't go in the direction of relaxation. It goes in the direction of increasing. Although I will say we have a lot of people who rebuilt without pulling permits, which is now becoming an issue about whether can you reimburse people for non-permitted rebuilds, et cetera, et cetera. So.
And then this one I think you'll be there to.
We have multifamily rental buildings that can have 80 units of market rental intermixed with smaller numbers of Office of Housing administered units. Does Houston have that? Could it work with Cdbg funds? So we have mixed income. We'll underwrite a multifamily development. We'll fund 25% of the cost of the development. There'll be market rate units, and then 50% of them will be guaranteed affordable for income qualified renters. And that's the 11 deals that we just did. Almost all of those have that characteristic. We also do some permanent supportive housing. We're about to do an RFP that's exclusively for permanent supportive housing. And we're using, so homelessness should be part of how you think about housing recovery. And we've designated, in our first, we'll do 3 tranches of $15 million for public services, which is, your mental health, your legal services, that sort of thing. $4 million of that in our first round was reserved for homelessness spending.
Now we'll open up questions.
Hi, my name is Deborah Reinhardt, and I work with the Federal Grants Management Unit, which runs the Cdbg program. So I'm keenly interested in those conversations about the crossover, and I actually have 2 questions. One of them is I was looking at your demographics, and it looks like Houston was predominantly homeowners versus renters, and we have the flip situation where we have a very high percentage of renters. Was there a difference in the way you worked with the homeowners and the renters? What were the critical differences to help them stabilize right after the disaster and for temporary housing? And then the second question is a bit farther down the line on the housing affordability issue. Is there anything you did or did not have a chance to do during the earlier, the first year or 2 after recovery that you feel like was a missed opportunity to deal with some of the affordability of replacement housing issues, or the reverse? You did something great and really happy you stumbled on that. Please enlighten us.
Let me take the second question first. The housing affordability in Houston, as I said, the median home price is about $300,000 in Houston, so a different context than here. But I think I included in the handout a chart of, how much you have to make to afford the median price home is rising, and it's certainly more than 80% of median income. So one of the key questions as you think about post-disaster affordability is you have to address displacement, and then what requirements are you going to attach in terms of how long the homeowner has to stay in the program. And different programs around the country answer that question in different ways. Because, I think in Louisiana, it's a 3-year residency requirement, which is pretty short by our standards. That if you receive, $80,000 of assistance to rebuild or repair your home, you would have to live in the home for 3 years before selling it. And how long is that period? For us, it ranges from, if it's under $20,000, there's no residency requirement. Under 20 is like 5 years, and then it goes up to 20 years. If you get $200,000 of assistance, that property remains affordable for 20 years. As you can imagine, that creates there's trade-offs because people are skeptical of the program. People don't like liens on their home. So there's a lot of negotiation that happens around that with the community. How do you balance fairness to the homeowner, to the taxpayer, to the community in terms of huge federal investment? You don't want to accelerate the process of displacement as you are improving and investing in neighborhoods.
And I'll just add, so we just had legislative session, and one of the things we worked on getting passed was a tiered taxation, local taxes on the property. So we're limiting how much property taxes can go up on the Cdbg DR developed homes or FEMA funded development homes following the disaster for 10 years. So we're not building you a new house and now you can't even afford to live in there if you wanted to because your property taxes have raised so quickly. So we did work on that, and that was a best practice legislatively. And then there were a couple other legislative moves related to disclosures. So when you buy a house in Texas, you have to disclose if it's in the 500-year floodplain right now. But the challenge was no one knew if they were or if they weren't, and that was such a misnomer as far as the definition of it. So now we've defined it better. If you're on your seller's disclosure, you now have to say, have you ever had a claim on your house? Has your house ever been flooded and provide federal assistance? And we also made it in legislation for renters. So now renters have some teeth and some knowledge and advocacy in the game, because now their landlords have to disclose if that property is required to have flood insurance, if that property is ever flooded. So trying to make those strides within the state, within our capability, I think is important to consider.
My focus is around VOADs that I work with. And I'm curious, from the experiences that you guys had pre the events that were happening, how did that change what you do with them now? I mean, are you more involved with them? Have they learned how to work with you differently, and or have you guys involved them more?
So I used to supervise the state voluntary agency liaison, so my lens is very different. I'll say that honestly. I've worked with voluntary agencies for a long time. I am a volunteer with a disaster response group as well. I was a volunteer firefighter. Did volunteer search and rescue for 15 years, so that's in my blood. So my thought about including them in plans has always been there, but I think the state now is seeing that, and their role is so important. So we are seeing the way Texas breaks it out as far as emergency operations is you have the State Emergency Operations Center, and then we have district offices that kind of cover sections and regions of the state. There are voluntary agencies present in those regional EOCs as well. There are voluntary agencies present in most of the major city EOCs as well, because we need them to be a part of that conversation from before the storm even lands or right after the disaster hits. Because we do see beyond floods, we do see, we had a major fertilizer plant explosion a few years back that really was a huge impact to the community. So we see things like that we're also incorporating them into the roles. But I think bringing them into stakeholder engagement for plans, bringing them into your EOCs, having them part of your exercises, having them part of your planning studies and present at events like this, which I do see is awesome. That is absolutely key to all of it. And valuing what they bring to the table. So don't just lean on them to provide free resources, because guess what? Their money goes away after a while. So the more kudos you can give to them to bring light to their efforts actually helps you in the long run. Because if you are praising them for the work that they've done, or JJ Watt, for the money he's contributed, then that helps sustain that funding for your jurisdiction longer. Because we know that they have to be accountable to their dollars as well and their donors.
Just building on that, in my pre-city experience, the other thing that was very challenging in the height of the storm at this mega shelter was the influx of non-practiced volunteers. And the head of the volunteer network, who's supposed to be the point person, was flooded. So at one point, some guy comes up to me, he's like, I just drove here from Louisiana, and if you just give me a bunch of medical supplies, I'm going to set up a hospital. And you're like, okay, please don't do that. But we had so much outpouring of capacity, so much donated goods, that the management of all of that, often by people who were not plugged into the VOAD, who were not the practiced volunteers, was a huge strain on the system. And it took a while for the more experienced volunteers to get set up. So,
definitely, just word of advice, spend a lot of time talking about managing volunteers and donations at some point. Won't even go down that rabbit hole right now, but that has to be part of your conversation. It will wreck your experience if you don't have good plans in place for that.
Do you have a sense of what the city workforce, how much they were impacted during this time, and if was there any sort of special program or incentives to help those employees recover who had provided critical services?
I don't have good data. The storm. I started working for the city about 6 months after the storm. I don't have a good sense of how many people were affected, but I do know that it was a pretty patchwork. It was so much bigger than anyone had anticipated, and so city agencies were called on to do lots of different things. And the housing department, which you would think in planning standards should really be involved in long-term recovery, was doing a lot on homelessness transition, a lot on helping people relocate into temporary housing in the disaster event itself.
I would say plan for your staff, like when you think about EOCs and staffing your agencies in a disaster, plan for at least 5 layers of depth, if not more. Because as Sarah mentioned, there were shelters that were open for a month, if not longer. So can your voluntary agencies that staff your shelters, do they have that much depth? If Barb's house is destroyed by the big quake, can Barb even get to work to be your emergency management director for the agency, right? We had lots of local, federal, state, regional staff who were impacted by the storm. So they had to take care of their own families and their own needs while trying to also take care of the entire community. So the state of Texas has we call it the EMAT team. So basically jurisdictions from unaffected regions within the state. So it's similar to EMACing from out of state, but it's within the state. So West Texas was not affected. So we could bring in people from West Texas to help run EOCs. We could bring them in to set up volunteer reception centers. We could bring them in to run various programs because they already had emergency management knowledge and experience, but they could plus up. Our big employers also had to do that. They had to have bring employees in from other areas. The conflict with all of that is when you have a TSA program and you're housing disaster survivors in hotels, and you can't find hotels for the people you're bringing in to help you. There's always going to be a need for that.
And just as we've described how the federal government is turning to the state to do temporary, to absorb functions historically performed by the federal government, the state is then also devolving big chunks of responsibility to the cities as well. So all of that flows down, and I think for you all as the biggest city, you may be asked to do things. We don't have EMAC agreements with other jurisdictions like the state does. So it was a lot of kind of drawing on resourcefulness and internal capacity in unexpected ways within the city in that immediate response.
Great. So now that you've been through a number of recent hazards with floods and fires, thinking about hindsight and also planning for the future with more increasing hazards, what are you doing over the long term to reduce the demand for housing recovery, particularly as we're seeing more population growth in some of our bigger cities, including Seattle?
I mean, for us, a lot of that has to do with resilient design. When we look at the numbers from previous storms, this is just going to be so much bigger, and I think there's some interesting parallels as you all think about the big one. I was looking at some numbers from Hurricane Ike, which again was in 2008. The recovery took a long time. HUD suspended our funding for a time. It was a whole story. But in total, the program repaired 500 homes in the city of Houston. And we're talking now about 4,000 to 5,000 homes just in our home repair program alone, and then another several thousand units coming online in the multifamily program. So this is really a generational investment in affordability and resilience. And I think for you all to think about this, the influx of resources, I think Krista said it exactly right. The FEMA program is one for one, but the HUD program is really your long-term planning and building not just what was there before, but what you want to see for the future. And it's a chance to do things like build in affordability requirements into your multifamily, or to require design standards for single family. And so having that vision in mind, and one of the things that you can do now, I think, Barb mentioned this earlier, is what are your values? And you can design a program in line with your values around, for us, equity was really important. And so, you see that we've got 80% of our funds reserved for low and moderate income people. Resilient design, those sorts of things you can build into your program and be having a strong sense of what those values are so that they can inform the plan when it eventually becomes time to write the plan. I think you start from a strong place.
I would say too, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, they do a lot of great information and research around resilient home building for all sorts of disasters. And if you get an opportunity to travel to the Carolinas to see them, they have a test facility where they literally blow up houses or catch them on fire or shake them in an earthquake. And that's the type of stuff they're doing, but it informs the type of resilient building that you're doing. HUD requires certain standards when it comes to building houses. You have to build them certain resilient standards. The challenge is they say you have to build it to green standard as one of them, for example. What folks don't realize is there's a difference between green standard and green certified, or star certified versus star, right? So which level are you going to choose and what are you going to implement? And that comes down, where's the finance people in the room? That comes down to your procurement. Okay, so if you are not putting that type of language in your procurement when you're procuring builders, they're going to give you star homes, not star certified, or green, but not green certified, right? So thinking about that, the other thing we've done thinking about the future is we've already gone out for procurement for the next 4 years. Because one of the things that slows you down in all this minutia and process is procurement. And so we have contracts in place for the next 4 years. Whether we turn them on or not, that's fine. But we've gone out to bid. We'll send a best and final offer or BAFO out when it comes to the time we actually need to use them. So we're actually negotiating at the right price for that time period. But we've put those pre-procurements in place and done some IDIQs so that we have that available so it doesn't take us as long.
I have no idea if anyone else is expected in the room, so I'm gonna wrap us up. If you have a couple of other questions, we'll stick around in the room. But first and foremost, I do want to thank members of our congressional delegation who have sent staff to this and sat all the way through the entire thing. Thank you so much. The Mayor's Chief Resiliency Officer for being in the room with us throughout the entire day, and most especially because, as we heard, this has to be a partnership between King County, the state of Washington, and FEMA Region 10, and we were thrilled to have Tom and Quinn and Tom and Quinn and Tom in the room with us. That was absolutely great. Most importantly, though, is to learn, I can't remember what TV show you got to phone a friend, but we're planning on phoning our new friends in Texas from now on when we go through this. So join me in thanking Krista and what's her name, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. For those of you who have been asking, how do I get my hands on the materials that we were exposed to today, we do plan on our website, seattle.gov/emergency, to post the PowerPoint slides and the handout that Sarah shared with us. The website, again, is seattle.gov/emergency. Thank you all so much for being here today. We got a couple of minutes before we spirit these guys off to lunch, so if you have any other questions you'd like to ask one-on-one, feel free. One last round of applause for both you and for them.